They teach you in history class that the expansion of the United States was inevitable. A manifest destiny that rolled across the continent like a tidal wave, sweeping aside everything in its path. They tell you that the Native American tribes, however brave, were doomed to be conquered by the superior technology and numbers of the U.S. Army. And they tell you that the enslaved people of the South were passive victims, waiting for a great emancipator to sign a piece of paper in 1863. But there is a chapter in American history that they did not put in your textbooks. A chapter they deliberately ripped out because it shattered the myth of white invincibility. It is the story of the only Indian war the United States government arguably lost. It is the story of the largest slave rebellion in American history, not a revolt that lasted a few days like Nat Turner's, but a full-scale war that raged for decades. In the fever-choked swamps of Florida, the United States Army threw its best generals, its elite soldiers, and millions of dollars against a phantom enemy they could not catch and could not kill. They were fighting the Seminole Nation, yes. But the backbone of the resistance, the warriors who struck the deepest fear into the hearts of the American plantation owners, were not Indians by birth. They were escaped slaves. They were the Maroons, the Black Seminoles. And leading them was a man who played the U.S. government like a fiddle, a warrior diplomat named John Horse. They said a black man could not outthink a West Point general. They said a runaway slave could not negotiate treaties with presidents. They said that freedom was a gift to be granted, not a prize to be seized at gunpoint. John Horse spent 40 years proving them wrong. He defeated the slave hunters. He outlasted the armies. And when the United States finally realized they could not defeat him, they had to pay him to leave. This is the story of the Unconquered. To understand why this war was so terrifying to the American establishment, you have to understand what Florida was in the early 19th century. To the white plantation owners of Georgia and the Carolinas, Florida was not a vacation destination. It was a nightmare. It was a sanctuary. For generations, enslaved Africans had been escaping their masters and slipping into the Spanish-controlled wilderness of Florida. There, they did not just hide, they built a new society. They formed an alliance with the Seminole Indians, a tribe that was itself a collection of refugees from other Creek tribes pushed south by American expansion. It was a unique relationship. The Black Seminoles lived in their own villages, raised their own crops, and carried their own weapons. In exchange for protection and a tribute of crops, the Seminoles gave them freedom. It was a feudal relationship on paper, but in reality, they were brothers in arms. The Seminoles knew the land, but the Black Seminoles knew the white man. They spoke English. They understood the psychology of the slave owners. They knew exactly what was coming for them. By the 1830s, this alliance had become an existential threat to the United States. It was not just that slaves were escaping, it was what they were becoming. Imagine the terror of a Georgia plantation owner looking south and knowing that just across the border, there were hundreds of black men walking around with rifles, living as free men, raising families, and answering to no master. It was a bad example that could infect the entire slave system. If the slaves in Georgia found out that freedom was possible, not in the distant north, but right there in the swamps, the whole brutal economy of the South could collapse. So, the United States government made a decision. The Seminoles had to go. The land was valuable, yes, but the example was dangerous. Under the Indian Removal Act, the government ordered the Seminoles to leave Florida and march west to the Oklahoma Territory. It was the beginning of the Trail of Tears. But for the Black Seminoles, this order was a death sentence. They knew that if they gathered at the assembly points to be moved west, the white slave catchers would be waiting. Any blackface without freedom papers would be shackled and sold back into the hell of the sugar and cotton fields. The Seminole chiefs were hesitant. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to leave peacefully. But the Black Seminoles, led by men like John Horse, knew there was no negotiation with a man who wants to own you. They whispered in the ears of the chiefs. They stiffened the spines of the warriors. They made it clear, if you surrender, you lose your land. If we surrender, we lose our lives. And so, when the U.S. Army marched into Florida in 1835 to enforce the removal, they did not find a submissive population ready for transport. They walked into a buzzsaw. John Horse, known to his people as Gopher John or Juan Caballo, was the embodiment of this resistance. He was a striking figure, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, usually dressed in a mix of Seminole finery and military garb. He was a master marksman, a brilliant tracker, and fluent in Seminole, Spanish, and English. But his greatest weapon was his mind. He understood that they could not beat the U.S. Army in a pitched battle. The Americans had cannons, they had endless supplies, they had thousands of men. So John Horse and the Seminole leaders, like the famous Osceola, devised a different kind of war. A war of ghosts. They would strike from the swamps and vanish before the smoke cleared. They would use the terrain, the sawgrass, the snakes, the heat, the disease, as their ally. They would turn Florida into a graveyard for American soldiers. The inciting incident of the Second Seminole War, the moment the United States realized they had made a fatal mistake, happened on December 28, 1835. It is known as the Dade Massacre. Major Francis Dade, a confident officer who believed the savages would never dare attack a full column of regulars, was marching 110 men from Fort Brooke to Fort King. He did not send out scouts. He did not take precautions. He was marching through the Pine Barrens as if he were on a parade ground. Hidden in the palmettos alongside the road were 180 warriors. About half were Seminole Indians. The other half were Black Seminoles. They lay in wait for hours, silent, invisible. When Dade's column was perfectly exposed, a single shot rang out. Major Dade fell dead from his horse. Then, the entire forest erupted. It was a slaughter. The American soldiers, drilled in the Napoleonic tactics of standing in lines and firing volleys, were cut to pieces by an enemy they could not even see. The Black Seminoles, men who had been forbidden to touch a gun in their former lives, fired with deadly precision. Within hours, 108 of the 110 American soldiers were dead. It was the worst defeat of the U.S. Army in the entire history of the Indian Wars, worse than Custer's last stand in terms of the percentage of the force killed. When news of the massacre reached Washington, the reaction was shock and fury. How could a modern army be wiped out by savages and runaway Negroes? The narrative was shattered. The newspapers screamed for vengeance. General Thomas Jessup, a man who prided himself on his ruthlessness, was sent to Florida with a massive force and a simple order: exterminate them. Capture the slaves. Remove the Indians. End it. But General Jessup had no idea who he was fighting. He thought he was fighting a disorganized rabble. He was about to find out that he was fighting the most disciplined, motivated, and desperate guerrilla force on the continent. John Horse and his men were not fighting for territory. They were not fighting for a flag. They were fighting for the right to not be things. And that made them more dangerous than any army Jessup had ever faced. As the army poured into Florida, John Horse led his people deeper into the cove of the Withlacoochee, a vast, impenetrable labyrinth of swamps and islands. From this fortress of mud and cypress trees, they launched a campaign of terror that paralyzed the American South. They did not just attack soldiers. They attacked the plantations. In a series of coordinated raids, John Horse and the Black Seminoles struck the great sugar plantations of East Florida. They burned the manor houses. They destroyed the sugar mills. But most importantly, they liberated the slaves. They swept through the fields like a hurricane of freedom, taking hundreds of enslaved people with them back into the swamps. It was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, but the history books call it the Second Seminole War to disguise the racial reality of what was happening. For the U.S. Army, the war became a humiliation. Soldiers were dying by the hundreds, not just from bullets, but from malaria, yellow fever, and heat exhaustion. Their uniforms rotted off their bodies. Their boots fell apart in the mud. They were chasing shadows. Every time they thought they had the Seminoles cornered, John Horse would find a way out. He would lead them into an ambush, or slip away across a river at night, or, in his most cunning moments, he would ride into the American camp under flag of truce, negotiate, gather intelligence, eat their food, and then disappear again before they realized he had played them. General Jessup was desperate. His career was being destroyed by a group of escaped slaves. He wrote back to Washington in frustration, admitting a truth that no one wanted to hear. This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war. He realized that as long as the Black Seminoles were fighting, the Seminole Indians would never surrender. The black warriors were the steel in the spine of the resistance because they knew there was no surrender for them, only chains or death. So, the United States Army, the growing superpower of the Western Hemisphere, decided that if they could not beat John Horse on the battlefield, they would have to cheat. They would have to throw away the rules of war. And they would have to offer the one thing they swore they never would: freedom. But even that offer would turn out to be another trap in a war that seemed destined to never end. Honor is a luxury of the victors. When a superpower is losing to a ragtag force of savages and escaped slaves, honor is the first thing to be thrown overboard. By 1837, General Thomas Jessup was a desperate man. The war in Florida was a bleeding ulcer. The American public was tired of reading about dead soldiers. The Treasury was tired of paying for a stalemate. Jessup knew he could not defeat John Horse and the Seminole chiefs like Osceola on the battlefield. They were too fast, too smart, and too familiar with the terrain. So, Jessup decided to weaponize the one thing the Seminoles still respected: the white flag of truce. In October 1837, Jessup sent word to Osceola and the other leaders. He proposed a parley. He suggested that they meet under a flag of truce to discuss a cessation of hostilities. To the Seminoles and their black allies, the white flag was sacred. It was a universal symbol of honor that even enemies respected. Osceola, weary from years of fighting and suffering from malaria, agreed. He rode into the American camp near Ste. Augustine, accompanied by his sub-chiefs and, crucially, by John Horse. They walked into the camp with their heads high, expecting a negotiation. Instead, at a prearranged signal from Jessup, the American soldiers surrounded them. Muskets were leveled. The white flag was trampled into the mud. In a single moment of breathtaking perfidy, the United States Army captured the leadership of the resistance without firing a shot. It was a kidnapping disguised as diplomacy. The American press, usually thirsty for victory, was appalled. They called it a stain on the national honor. But Jessup did not care. He had his prisoners. They were dragged to the Castillo de San Marcos in Ste. Augustine, an imposing Spanish fortress made of coquina stone, impenetrable and inescapable. Or so the Americans thought. They threw Osceola, John Horse, and the warrior Coacucci, Wild Cat, into a dungeon cell with a single, tiny window high up on the wall. They believed the war was effectively over, but they had underestimated John Horse and Wild Cat. Osceola was sick and dying, his spirit broken by the treachery. But John Horse was plotting. He looked at that tiny window, barely wide enough for a child, and he made a decision. They would not rot in that cell. They would starve themselves until they were thin enough to squeeze through the bars. 4 weeks, they ate almost nothing. They grew gaunt, their ribs showing through their skin. But their muscles remained wiry and tense. On the night of November 29, 1837, they made their move. Using a makeshift rope made from torn-up bedding, John Horse boosted Wild Cat up to the window. The warrior squeezed through, scraping his flesh on the rough stone, and dropped into the moat below. Then it was John Horse's turn. He shimmied through the opening, falling silently into the darkness. They were free. They disappeared back into the swamps like ghosts. When the guards checked the cell the next morning, they found only the dying Osceola and an empty window. The news of the escape hit the army like a thunderbolt. The leaders of the rebellion were loose again. And they were angry. John Horse and Wild Cat did not just run, they rallied. They gathered every warrior left in the glades, Seminole and Black, and prepared for a final, apocalyptic stand. They chose their ground carefully, a hammock near Lake Okeechobee, surrounded by sawgrass and mud. They knew the army would come for them. And on Christmas Day, 1837, the army arrived. Leading the American forces was Colonel Zachary Taylor, a rough, ambitious officer who would later become the President of the United States. Taylor had over 1,000 men. The Seminoles had less than 400. Taylor, eager for glory and dismissive of his enemy's tactical genius, ordered a frontal assault directly through the swamp. It was a trap. John Horse and his Black Seminoles were positioned in the center of the line, hidden in the dense foliage. As Taylor's men waded through the muck, waist-deep in water, unable to move quickly or take cover, the Black Seminoles opened fire. The first volley was devastating. The American officers, identifiable by their uniforms, were picked off one by one. It was a turkey shoot. The Battle of Okeechobee is often claimed as a U.S. victory because the Seminoles eventually retreated. But look at the Butcher bill. The U.S. Army suffered massive casualties, 26 killed and 112 wounded. The Seminoles lost only 11 warriors. John Horse and his men had bled the army white and then slipped away into the darkness to fight another day. Zachary Taylor declared victory, but privately, the army knew the truth. They had been outfought by escaped slaves. General Jessup had had enough. He realized a fundamental truth that the politicians in Washington refused to see. The Black Seminoles were fighting to the death because they had no other choice. If they surrendered, they went back to slavery. Therefore, they would never surrender. The only way to end the war was to change the equation. In 1838, General Thomas Jessup, a slave-owning officer from the South, did the unthinkable. He offered a deal to John Horse. If the Black Seminoles would stop fighting and agree to move west to the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, the U.S. Army would guarantee their freedom. They would not be returned to their masters. They would be treated as free people, living under the protection of the Seminole tribe. This was revolutionary. Decades before Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a U.S. general issued what historians call the Jessup Proclamation. It was the first time the United States government had been forced to grant freedom to armed black rebels simply because the government could not defeat them. It was a victory won not by moral appeal, but by the barrel of a gun. John Horse was skeptical. He knew the white man's word was often worthless. He had the capture of Osceola as proof. But he also knew his people were starving. The war had destroyed their farms. Their children were dying of disease. He looked at the deal, and he saw a chance for survival. He negotiated hard. He demanded written guarantees. And finally, believing he had secured a future for his people, he agreed. The Black Seminoles surrendered. They came out of the swamps, not in chains, but carrying their rifles. They boarded the ships that would take them across the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans, and from there, up the Mississippi River to their new home in the West. But the Trail of Tears is not just a story of walking, it is a story of dying. The journey was a nightmare. Disease swept through the overcrowded boats. Cholera, smallpox, and dysentery claimed hundreds of lives. They watched their loved ones die on the decks of steamboats and buried them in shallow graves along the muddy banks of the Arkansas River. They were leaving the land they had fought for, the only home many of them had ever known, for a dry, dusty unknown. When they finally arrived in the Indian Territory, they found that the promised land was another trap. The U.S. government had placed them on land belonging to the Creek Nation. The Creeks were slaveholders. They looked at these free black strangers with suspicion and greed. To the Creeks, and to the white slave catchers who roamed the territory with impunity, the status of the Black Seminoles was vague. Were they really free? Or were they just lost property waiting to be claimed? The written guarantees John Horse had wrung from General Jessup began to evaporate. The army officers in the territory were indifferent. Freedom papers were ignored. Kidnappings became common. A Black Seminole woman would go to the river to wash clothes and never return, snatched by a gang of slavers and sold into Texas or Arkansas. The Black Seminoles had traded the dangers of the Florida swamps for the terror of the open plains. John Horse realized with a cold dread that the war was not over. It had just changed venues. He was no longer a general. He was a politician, a lawyer, and a diplomat, constantly traveling to Washington, D.C., pleading with the government to honor its word. He met with presidents and generals, showing them the papers Jessup had signed. They nodded, they made promises, and then they did nothing. The pressure mounted. The Creek Nation passed laws explicitly stripping the Black Seminoles of their rights, demanding they submit to Creek laws, laws that included slavery. The Attorney General of the United States issued a ruling declaring that, despite Jessup's promises, the Black Seminoles were technically still slaves because a general did not have the authority to free them. It was the ultimate betrayal. The United States had used a promise of freedom to disarm them, move them halfway across the continent, and was now preparing to hand them back to the wolves. John Horse looked at his people. He saw the fear in their eyes. He saw the slave catchers circling like vultures. He realized that the United States would never let them be free. As long as they were on American soil, they were targets. The freedom of the Indian Territory was a lie. He called a council of the Black Seminole leaders. He stood before them, a man graying at the temples but with the same fire in his eyes that had burned at Okeechobee. He told them that there was no hope in Washington. He told them that they had been cheated. But John Horse had one more card to play. He had heard rumors of another land. A land to the south, across another river. A land where slavery had been abolished decades ago. A land that was desperate for warriors to protect its northern border. Mexico. It sounded like madness. To get there, they would have to cross the entire state of Texas, a slave state teeming with Texas Rangers, Comanche war parties, and white settlers who would shoot a free black man on sight. It was a suicide march of hundreds of miles through the most hostile territory on earth. But John Horse asked them, "Do you want to die as slaves here, or die as free men on the road?" The Black Seminoles made their choice. In the dead of night, in 1849, they packed their wagons. They loaded their rifles. And led by John Horse and his Seminole ally Wildcat, they began the longest, most dangerous escape attempt in American history. They were turning their backs on the United States forever. They were making a run for the Rio Grande. And the slave catchers were right behind them. The map of North America in 1849 was a minefield for a black man. To the north lay the free states, but the Fugitive Slave Act was tightening the noose, turning the entire country into a hunting ground where no black person was truly safe. To the east lay the ocean. To the west lay the endless, hostile plains. But to the south, across the vast, scorching expanse of Texas, lay the Republic of Mexico. And Mexico was different. In 1829, Mexico had abolished slavery. It was a nation where the color of a man's skin did not determine his legal standing. For John Horse and his followers, Mexico was not just a country, it was the new Canaan. But to get there, they had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The exodus began in the dead of winter. It was a column of roughly 700 souls. About 200 were Black Seminoles, men, women, and children who had refused to submit to the Creek slavers. The rest were Seminole Indians led by the legendary chief Coacoochee, or Wildcat. Wildcat and John Horse were brothers in everything but blood. They had fought together in the swamps of Florida, rotted together in the dungeon of St. Augustine, and escaped together through that tiny window. Now, they were riding together into the unknown. Wildcat was disillusioned with the U.S. government's lies. He dreamed of establishing a confederation of tribes in Mexico, free from American interference. John Horse just wanted his people to stop being hunted. They moved with the discipline of a Roman legion. This was not a disorderly flight of refugees. It was a mobile army. John Horse organized the column with military precision. The women, children, and the elderly rode in the wagons or walked in the center. The warriors, armed with the best rifles they could steal or trade for, rode on the flanks and the rearguard. They slept with their weapons. They ate in shifts. They knew that they were being tracked. The Creek slavers were furious. To them, the flight of the Black Seminoles was a massive theft of capital. These were not people leaving. This was money walking away. A heavily armed posse of Creek warriors and white slave catchers was assembled to chase them down. They were motivated by greed and the promise of a massive payout if they could drag the runaways back to the Indian Territory. And ahead of them lay the Texas Rangers, a paramilitary force that viewed any armed group of Indians or blacks as a target practice. The journey across Texas took months. It was a grueling test of endurance. They crossed the Red River, entering the killing fields of the Comanche, the empire of the Comanche, the most feared horse warriors on the continent. The Comanche raided anyone who crossed their territory. But when their scouts saw the discipline of John Horse's column, when they saw the way the Black Seminoles sat their horses and held their rifles, they largely kept their distance. Game recognizes game. The Black Seminoles were not settlers. They were hard targets. Water was scarce. The heat was relentless. The dust coated their throats and cracked their lips. But John Horse kept them moving. The river, he would tell them. Just get to the river. He knew the geography. He knew that the Rio Grande was the finish line. Once they crossed that water, the laws of the United States, the laws that said they were property, would dissolve. By the summer of 1850, the column was exhausted. Their horses were gaunt, their supplies were nearly gone, and the pursuit was closing in. The Creek slavers had cut the distance. They could smell the dust of the Seminole wagons. As John Horse approached the border, near the modern-day town of Eagle Pass, the tension snapped. They reached the banks of the Rio Grande. It was a wide, muddy ribbon of water, swirling with dangerous currents. On the far side lay Mexico. Freedom. But they had a problem. They had wagons, women, and children who could not swim. They needed to build rafts. They needed time. And time was the one thing they did not have. As they began to fell trees to construct makeshift ferries, the dust cloud on the northern horizon announced the arrival of their pursuers. The slave catchers had caught up. It was a classic cinematic standoff. On the bluffs overlooking the river, the pursuing force reined in their horses. They looked down at the chaotic scene on the riverbank. They saw the Black Seminoles frantically lashing logs together. They saw the women pushing children into the water. They checked their rifles. They had the high ground. They had the numbers. They prepared to charge, expecting a massacre. They expected the runaways to panic and surrender. But John Horse did not panic. He rode his horse into the middle of the river, the water swirling around his waist. He turned his back to Mexico and faced the United States. He raised his rifle, and alongside him, a line of Black Seminole warriors formed a wall of flesh and steel between their families and the slavers. They did not fire. They just waited. They looked up at the men who wanted to own them and dared them to come down. The slave catchers hesitated. They looked at the grim determination of the men in the water. They remembered the stories of the Florida swamps, of how these men fought like demons when cornered. They realized that to take these slaves, they would have to pay a butcherous price. And then, something else happened. On the Mexican side of the river, a patrol of Mexican soldiers appeared. They watched the drama unfolding. They saw a group of black and indigenous people trying to cross to freedom, pursued by armed Americans. The Mexican commander made a decision. He did not block the crossing. He waved them over. He signaled that they were welcome. The slave catchers cursed. They fired a few shots in frustration, kicking up splashes in the river, but they did not charge. They knew that if they crossed the river to pursue, they would be invading a sovereign nation and starting an international incident. They watched, helpless, as the rafts pushed off. They watched as John Horse, the last man to cross, guided his horse through the deep channel and climbed onto the muddy bank of Mexico. As he stood on Mexican soil, dripping wet, John Horse looked back across the river. He was penniless. His people were starving. They had lost almost everything they owned on the trail. But they owned themselves. For the first time in generations, no white man had a claim on their bodies. The Rio Grande was not just a river. It was a baptism. They washed off the dust of America and emerged as free subjects of Mexico. But freedom, as John Horse knew better than anyone, is never free. It has a price. The Mexican government welcomed them, but not out of pure altruism. Mexico was a chaotic, war-torn nation. Its northern border was a bleeding wound, constantly raided by Comanche and Apache war parties from Texas. The Mexican government had a proposal for Wildcat and John Horse. They would be granted land in the state of Coahuila. They would be given citizenship. They would be given tools and seeds. But in exchange, they had to become the border guards. They had to fight. The deal was simple: land for blood. The Mexican government needed a buffer force, a group of warriors tough enough to stand against the Comanche raids that were depopulating northern Mexico. They looked at the Black Seminoles, veterans of the Florida Wars, survivors of the Trail of Tears, men who had just marched across Texas, and they saw the perfect weapon. John Horse accepted. He had no choice. If his people wanted to eat, if they wanted a place to lay their heads without fear of the slave catcher's whip, they would have to fight for it. And so, the Black Seminoles of Mexico, known as Los Muskogos, were born. They settled in a town called Nacimiento de los Negros, birth of the blacks. It was a harsh, arid land at the headwaters of the Sabinas River. There was no cotton to pick here. There were no masters to serve. There were only rifles, horses, and the open desert. And they were magnificent. The Black Seminoles adapted to the borderlands with frightening speed. They learned the ways of the Mexican vaqueros. They became expert trackers in the desert scrub. They fought the Comanche and the Apache on their own terms, matching their ferocity and surpassing their discipline. Word spread quickly on the frontier. The Black Indians of Mexico were not to be trifled with. Texas slave owners, furious that their property had escaped, organized raiding parties to cross the border and kidnap the Muskogos back into slavery. It was an illegal invasion, a violation of sovereignty. In one famous incident, a group of Texas filibusters, mercenaries and slave hunters, crossed the Rio Grande, intending to sack Nacimiento and drag the Black Seminoles back to the cotton fields. They expected to find a village of frightened refugees. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw led by John Horse. The Muskogos ambushed them in the canyons. They fought with a ruthlessness born of trauma. They did not just defeat the Texans, they routed them. They sent the survivors limping back across the river with a message: "We are not slaves anymore. We are soldiers of Mexico. Come back, and you die." For 20 years, John Horse and his people served as the iron shield of northern Mexico. They protected the villages of Coahuila. They earned the respect of the Mexican army, receiving medals and commendations. They lived a hard life, a violent life, but a free life. They raised their children to speak Spanish, Seminole, and English. They built churches and schools. They created a unique culture, a blend of African, indigenous, and Mexican traditions that survives to this day. But the United States was not done with them. The Civil War ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. And the U.S. Army, now looking to secure its own borders and stop the Indian raids into Texas, looked south and remembered the fierce warriors they had fought in Florida. They remembered the men who had embarrassed Zachary Taylor. They remembered the unit that never lost. And the U.S. Army, in a twist of irony that only history could script, decided that they wanted John Horse back. They did not want him as a slave. They did not want him as a prisoner. They wanted him as a scout. They sent recruiters across the Rio Grande with an offer. "Come back to the United States," they said. "Put on the blue uniform. Fight for us against the Comanche and the Apache. And we will give you pay, rations, and the land we promised you 40 years ago." John Horse was an old man now. His body was scarred from 100 battles. He remembered the betrayal of General Jessup. He remembered the chains. He remembered the Trail of Tears. He did not trust the United States as far as he could throw a horse. But he also saw that his people were living in poverty in Mexico. The land was dry. The life was hard. The young men were restless. He looked at the contract. He looked at the blue uniforms. And with a heavy heart, filled with a skepticism that had kept him alive for 6 decades, he agreed to let his young warriors go. The Black Seminole Scouts were formed. They would ride north, back into the belly of the beast, to become the most elite, most decorated, and most betrayed unit in the history of the Indian Wars. The Unconquered were coming home. But they were about to find out that a uniform does not change the color of your skin in Texas. On August 16, 1870, a strange procession crossed the Rio Grande, moving north. They did not look like soldiers. They wore buckskins, moccasins, and wide-brimmed hats adorned with feathers. Their rifles were old, their horses were lean, and their faces bore the weathered, stoic look of men who had lived their entire lives in a state of war. But when they arrived at Fort Duncan, Texas, the sentries did not shoot. They opened the gates. The Unconquered had returned. They were sworn into the service of the United States Army not as regulars, but as scouts. The deal John Horse had struck with the U.S. military was a devilish bargain, born of desperation and hope. In exchange for their service as the eyes and ears of the Army in the brutal wars against the Comanche and Apache, the Black Seminoles were promised three things: pay, rations, and land. It was the land that mattered most. The Army recruiters had sworn that the government would grant them their own reservation, a permanent home in Texas where they could live in peace, protected by the very government that had once tried to enslave them. It was a promise written on paper, signed by officers, and sealed with the desperation of a starving people. John Horse, now an old man known as the Old Chief, believed that perhaps, finally, the Americans would honor a contract. The unit formed at Fort Clark was unlike anything the American military had ever seen. They were officially designated the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. They were a Special Forces unit a century before the term existed. While the famous Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, were regular regiments drilled in European tactics, the Scouts were guerrilla fighters. They did not march in lines. They did not sleep in barracks. They tracked. They could read the desert floor like a newspaper. They could tell you how many hours ago a horse had passed, whether it was lame, and how much weight it was carrying, just by looking at a disturbed patch of sand. They could survive for days on a handful of dried meat and the water from a cactus. And they were lethal. For the next 10 years, the Scouts were the tip of the spear in the Texas Indian Wars. They rode ahead of the main columns, walking into ambushes so the white soldiers would not have to. They engaged in 26 major campaigns and a dozen distinct battles. They hunted the most terrifying warriors on the continent, the Kickapoo, the Lipan Apache, and the Comanche, in the most unforgiving terrain imaginable. And in all those years of constant, close-quarters combat, the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts achieved a statistical impossibility. They never lost a single man in battle. Not one. Let that sink in. 12 major battles. Thousands of miles patrolled. Ambush after ambush. And 0 combat fatalities. It is a record of tactical perfection that stands alone in military history. It was not luck. It was a level of skill that bordered on the supernatural. They fought with a cohesion born of a lifetime of survival. They were not just a unit, they were a family. They fought for each other because they were literally brothers, cousins, and fathers. Their white commander was Lieutenant John Lapham Bullis, a wiry, ambitious Quaker from New York who had led black troops during the Civil War. Bullis was a complicated figure. He genuinely admired his scouts. He ate with them, rode with them, and fought alongside them. He called them the bravest men I ever saw. But he was also their handler, the intermediary between these free spirits and the rigid, racist hierarchy of the U.S. Army. The Scouts revered him, calling him the whirlwind for his energy. But their loyalty would eventually be tested by the very system Bullis represented. The heroism of the Scouts was not abstract. It was visceral and bloody. On April 25, 1875, the Scouts were tracking a band of Comanche raiders who had stolen a herd of horses. The trail led them to the Pecos River, to a crossing known as Eagle's Nest. It was bad ground, a tangle of rocks and brush, perfect for an ambush. Bullis had only 3 scouts with him: Sergeant John Ward, Trumpeter Isaac Payne, and Private Pompey Factor. Just 4 men against a war party of roughly 30 Comanche warriors. They dismounted and crept forward, hoping to surprise the enemy. But the Comanche were waiting. A withering volley of rifle fire erupted from the rocks. The air was filled with lead. Bullis and his 3 scouts returned fire, fighting desperately for 45 minutes. But they were outflanked and outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. The Comanche began to encircle them, preparing for the final rush to take their scalps. Bullis ordered a retreat to the horses. The 3 scouts scrambled back, vaulting into their saddles amidst a hail of bullets. They turned their horses and spurred them to safety. But in the chaos, the frantic dust and smoke, something went wrong. Bullis's horse had been spooked and broke away. The lieutenant was left behind on foot, stranded in the open, with 30 Comanche warriors charging down on him. It was a death sentence. Bullis was cut off. He was going to die. But the scouts did not keep riding. Sergeant John Ward looked back. He saw his lieutenant alone. He did not see a white man. He saw his leader. He shouted to Payne and Factor, "We CA not leave the lieutenant." Without a moment's hesitation, the 3 Black Seminoles turned their horses around. They rode straight back into the kill zone, directly into the teeth of the Comanche charge. The gunfire was intense, bullets kicking up dust around their horses' hooves, cutting through their clothes. Ward laid down a suppressing fire with his carbine, shooting with the deadly accuracy of a man who had been hunting since childhood. Factor and Payne rode alongside Bullis. One of them reached down, grabbed the lieutenant by the arm, and swung him up onto the back of the horse behind him. Then, riding double, firing over their shoulders, they galloped out of the trap, saving their commander's life by a margin of seconds. It was an act of supreme valor, a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie, but it happened in the dust of the Pecos River in 1875. For this action, John Ward, Isaac Payne, and Pompey Factor were awarded the Medal of Honor. Another scout, Adam Payne, had received the medal a year earlier for his solitary stand against the Comanche during the Red River War. For Medals of Honor for a unit that rarely numbered more than 50 men. It was the highest concentration of heroism in the entire U.S. Army. They had proven everything there was to prove. They were the elite of the elite. They wore the blue uniform. They wore the Medal of Honor around their necks. Surely, now, they had earned their place. Surely, now, they were Americans. But the town of Brackettville, Texas, which sat just outside the gates of Fort Clark, did not care about medals. To the white settlers, ranchers, and outlaws who populated the borderlands, the scouts were not heroes. They were just niggers with guns. And that was an offense that could not be tolerated. The tension between the scouts and the local population was a constant, simmering war. When the scouts rode into town to spend their pay, they were barred from saloons. They were harassed by the local sheriff. They were called every slur in the book by the very people whose cattle and lives they were protecting from Comanche raids. It was the ultimate paradox. On the patrol, they were gods of war, respected by generals and feared by enemies. But the moment they crossed the line back into civilization, they were second-class citizens, subject to the whims of a racist legal system. One night, the tension exploded. Adam Payne, the Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had fought the fiercest warriors on the plains, was at a New Year's Eve party near Fort Clark. The local sheriff, a man named Claris, had a grudge against Payne. There was a warrant out for Payne on a dubious charge. He was accused of killing a white man in a brawl, a charge Payne denied, claiming self-defense. Sheriff Claris did not come to arrest Adam Payne. He came to execute him. He crept up behind Payne while he was drinking coffee. He put a double-barreled shotgun to the back of the hero's head and pulled the trigger. He blew Adam Payne apart at such close range that his clothes were set on fire. The murder of a Medal of Honor recipient should have sparked a national outrage. There should have been an investigation. There should have been justice. Instead, nothing happened. The sheriff claimed Payne had resisted. The case was closed. The army did not intervene. The medal around his neck did not stop the buckshot, and his service did not buy him justice. John Horse watched all of this with a heavy heart. He was too old to ride on patrol now. He sat in the camp along Las Moras Creek, where the scouts lived in tents and shacks with their families. He held the paper that promised them land. He watched the young men come back with their medals, and he watched them get murdered in town. He saw the writing on the wall. By 1880, the Indian Wars were winding down. The Comanche were defeated, confined to reservations. The Apache were being hunted to extinction. The frontier was closed. The railroads were built. The civilization that the scouts had protected was now secure. And just like that, the Scouts became obsolete. The Army looked at its budget. They looked at this small, strange unit of black Indians living on government rations. And they decided they did not need them anymore. The betrayal did not happen all at once. It was a slow, strangling death. First, the rations were cut. Then, the pay was delayed. And finally, the question of the land, the one thing they had fought for, the one reason they had left Mexico, came to a head. The Scouts petitioned the government. They said, "We have done our part. We cleared the West. Where is our land?" General Sheridan, the commander of the army, forwarded their request to Washington. He praised them. He recommended that they be given the land they were promised. But the bureaucrats in the Department of the Interior looked at the map. They looked at the prime real estate around Fort Clark. And then they looked at the petitioners, black men, former slaves, not really Indians, not really citizens. The answer came back from Washington. It was a dry, legalistic letter. It stated that there was no record of any treaty granting land to Negroes. It stated that they were not eligible for Indian land grants because they were black, and they were not eligible for homesteading grants because they were not citizens. They were nothing. They were legally non-existent. The Army, the institution they had served with absolute loyalty, shrugged its shoulders. Lieutenant Bullis, the man whose life they had saved, the man they trusted, was moving up in the world. He was becoming a wealthy man, investing in land that his Scouts had cleared of enemies. He tried to help them, but he did not try hard enough. He did not resign in protest. He moved on. John Horse stood on the banks of Las Moras Creek and realized that the United States had lied to him again. The cycle was complete. General Jessup had lied in Florida. The government had lied in Oklahoma. And now, the Army had lied in Texas. The Unconquered had won every battle against the Comanche, but they had lost the war against the United States government without firing a shot. They were being evicted. The order came down. The Seminole Negro Indian Scouts were to be disbanded. They had to leave the fort. They had to leave the creek. They had nowhere to go. But John Horse was not a man to die on his knees begging for scraps. He was 80 years old. He was tired. But he looked south, across the Rio Grande. Mexico was still there. The land he had left was still there. He gathered his people one last time. Not all of them. Some stayed in Texas, clinging to the edges of the society that rejected them. But many, the old guard, the true believers. He mounted his horse. And for the last time in his incredible, epic life, John Horse turned his back on the United States of America. He rode back to the river. He did not have a pension. He did not have a medal. He did not have the land he was promised. But as he splashed across the Rio Grande, returning to the mountains of Mexico to die in freedom, he carried something that no white general, no president, and no sheriff could ever take away from him. He had never surrendered. He had never been conquered. But the story does not end in the 19th century. The final insult was yet to come. Because while John Horse rode away, the United States decided to do one last thing to the heroes who remained. They decided to steal their medals. When John Horse rode south into the twilight of the Mexican desert, he left behind a remnant. A small, stubborn community of Black Seminole families clung to the edges of Fort Clark, Texas. They were the wives, children, and grandchildren of the Scouts. They lived in a shantytown on the military reservation, a dusty collection of limestone huts and tents along Las Moras Creek. They stayed because they believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the United States Army would eventually do the right thing. They believed that the service of their fathers, the men who had tamed the Texas frontier, the men who wore the Medal of Honor, was a debt that the government had to pay. They were waiting for their land. They waited for 34 years. And in 1914, they got their answer. The Department of the Army decided to close the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Detachment. The frontier was gone. The Apache were gone. The Scouts were no longer needed. The order came down from Washington. The unit was disbanded. And with that order came a second, more brutal command. The families living on the Fort Clark reservation were ordered to leave. Immediately. There was no ceremony. There was no parade. There was no land grant. The families of the men who had never lost a single battle were told to pack their meager belongings and get out. They were evicted from the only home many of them had ever known. Medal of Honor recipients, aging warriors who could barely walk, were forced onto the road, destitute. They had spent their blood to secure Texas for white settlers, and now Texas had no place for them. They were cast out into a segregated, hostile society that viewed them not as heroes, but as vagrants. They did not go far. They could not. They settled in the town of Brackettville, just outside the Fortis Gates, living in poverty, working as ranch hands and laborious on the very lands they had once patrolled as kings of the high desert. But the physical eviction was only the first phase of their destruction. The second phase was the erasure of their memory. As the 20th century exploded into the age of cinema, America began to tell itself the story of the Wild West. Hollywood churned out thousands of westerns. They created a mythology of the frontier that captivated the world. In this myth, the West was won by square-jawed white men, John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart. The cavalry was always white. The cowboys were always white. The Black Seminoles were entirely bleached out of the narrative. When Hollywood needed to depict a scout or a tracker, they hired a white actor and put him in buckskins. When they showed the cavalry charging to the rescue, the faces under the blue caps were pale. The truth, that 1 in 5 soldiers on the frontier was black, and that the most elite unit of them all was a group of black Indians, was inconvenient. It did not fit the script of white supremacy. It complicated the simple story of civilization vs. savagery. So, the scouts were left on the cutting room floor of history. For decades, the only proof that they had ever existed was a small, dusty patch of ground outside Brackettville, the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Cemetery. It is a lonely place, baked by the Texas sun. But if you walk through the rusted gates, you will see something that exists nowhere else in America. You will see 4 Medal of Honor headstones in a single, small graveyard. Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, John Ward, Adam Payne. They lie there, side by side, the greatest warriors the army ever produced, resting in soil that they were never allowed to own. But the most stinging betrayal was not cultural, it was legal. And it did not happen in 1880. It happened in our lifetime. The Black Seminoles, or freedmen, had always considered themselves part of the Seminole Nation. They had fought together, bled together, and walked the Trail of Tears together. Their identity was forged in that alliance. But as the 20th century progressed, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, the descendants of those who had surrendered and moved west, began to distance themselves from their black cousins. Why? Money. In 1946, the United States government created the Indian Claims Commission to pay reparations to tribes for land that had been stolen from them in the 19th century. The Seminole Nation filed a claim for the land in Florida that was taken during the Seminole Wars, the very wars that John Horse and the Black Seminoles had fought. After decades of litigation, in 1976, the government awarded the Seminole Nation $16 million, a sum that grew to over $56 million with interest. It was a massive judgment, and the question arose, who gets the money? The Black Seminoles, the descendants of the Maroons, the people whose ancestors had been the steel and the spine of the resistance, the people who had fought and died to hold onto that Florida land, stepped forward. They said, "We are Seminoles. We fought. We suffered. We are entitled to a share of this judgment." But the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma said no. They argued that the Black Seminoles were not Indians by blood. They argued that they were merely slaves of the tribe, property that had no claim to the land. They used the racist logic of the 19th century to justify a 20th century greed. They rewrote history, claiming that the Black Seminoles had never been allies, only servants. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, the arm of the U.S. government that manages tribal relations, sided with the Blood Seminoles. They ruled that the Black Seminoles, despite their treaties, despite their service, despite the fact that General Jessup had negotiated with them as equals, were not eligible for the money. Imagine the cruelty of that verdict. The descendants of John Horse, living in poverty in Texas and Oklahoma, were told that their ancestors' sacrifice meant nothing. The wars they had fought, the victories they had won, victories that forced the U.S. government to the negotiating table in the first place, were erased. The $56 million payout for the land John Horse had defended was distributed among the Blood Seminoles, and the Black Seminoles got zero. Not a dime. This legal apartheid continues to this day. In the early 2000s, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma voted to amend their constitution to effectively strip the Black Seminoles, freedmen, of their tribal citizenship rights, denying them access to healthcare, housing benefits, and COVID-19 relief funds. It is a modern-day purging, a bureaucratic ethnic cleansing. So, here we stand. The Unconquered. The men who never lost a battle. The men who outsmarted the U.S. Army, escaped slavery, defeated the Comanche, and guarded the border. What is their reward? They have no land. Their descendants are fighting a legal battle for recognition against the very tribe they helped save. Their history is absent from the textbooks. Their medals are curiosities in a museum. And their cemetery in Brackettville is maintained not by the government, but by the struggling, proud descendants who refuse to let the weeds cover the graves of heroes. The story of the Black Seminoles is the ultimate indictment of the American promise. It proves that you can do everything right, you can fight with honor, you can serve with distinction, you can believe in the law, and the system will still find a way to cheat you if you are the wrong color. They were the ultimate survivalists, but they could not survive the pen of the bureaucrat and the greed of the revisionist historian. But there is a reason we are telling this story now. There is a reason why, despite the erasure, the name of John Horse refuses to die. Because a legacy written in blood is harder to wash away than a legacy written in ink. The wind that blows through the mesquite trees at the cemetery in Brackettville whispers a truth that Hollywood could not kill and the courts could not silence. The United States did not give them freedom. The Seminole Nation did not give them identity. They took it. They forged it. And they held it for as long as they could. As we move to the final chapter of this saga, we have to look at what remains. We have to look at the scattered descendants, the Gullah Geechee of the West, who still gather on Seminole days to honor their ancestors. And we have to ask ourselves a hard question. In a country that loves to talk about supporting the troops and honoring heritage, why is the most successful, most heroic, and most unique unit in our history treated like a dirty secret? The answer lies in the mirror. To acknowledge the Black Seminoles is to acknowledge that the West was not won by white men. It was policed by black men. To acknowledge them is to admit that the U.S. government broke its treaties not just with Indians, but with black veterans. To acknowledge them is to admit that the greatest freedom fighters in American history were not the founding fathers, but the slaves who picked up rifles and said no more. John Horse died in Mexico, a free man. His grave is lost to time. But his spirit is waiting. It is waiting for the country that betrayed him to finally have the courage to look him in the eye. Go to Brackettville, Texas, today. Drive past the fading storefronts, out onto the farm-to-market road where the asphalt cracks under the relentless heat. Turn onto the dirt track that leads to the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Cemetery. It is not Arlington. There are no eternal flames, no changing of the guard, no rows of white marble stretching to the horizon. It is a humble plot of earth, surrounded by a chain-link fence, guarded only by the mesquite trees and the silence of the borderlands. But if you stand there, amidst the rough limestone markers, you are standing on the holiest ground of American resistance. Here lies Adam Payne, the Medal of Honor recipient blown apart by a sheriff's shotgun. Here lies Pompey Factor, who rode back into the kill zone to save his commander. Here lies Isaac Payne, the trumpeter who sounded the charge when others would have sounded the retreat. And here lies John Ward, the sergeant who never left a man behind. They are all here. The Unconquered. The men who defied the empires of Spain, Britain, Mexico, and the United States, and remained, until their final breath, free men. But the tragedy of this cemetery is not that they are dead. It is that they are hidden. The erasure of the Black Seminoles is not an accident of history. It is a crime of history. It is a deliberate amnesia cultivated by a nation that cannot reconcile its mythology with its reality. To teach the story of John Horse and his scouts is to dismantle the entire romantic fiction of the American West. We are taught that the frontier was tamed by the rugged individualism of white settlers. We are taught that the U.S. Army was the vanguard of civilization. But the graves in Brackettville tell a different story. They tell us that the rugged individualism of the settlers was protected by the collective discipline of black soldiers. They tell us that the civilization of the army was often less honorable than the savages it fought. They tell us that the greatest feats of tracking, riding, and fighting in the West were performed not by cowboys, but by maroons, men who carried the trauma of slavery in their hearts and the map of the desert in their minds. If John Horse were a white man, there would be statues of him in Washington, D.C. There would be movies about him starring the biggest actors in Hollywood. His face would be on postage stamps. He led the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. He negotiated treaties with presidents. He founded towns in 2 different countries. He defeated the Texas Rangers. He saved the Mexican border. He is, by any objective measure, one of the founding fathers of the North American frontier. But because he was black, because he was Seminole, and because he embarrassed the powers that be, he has been relegated to the shadows. This erasure serves a purpose. It allows America to maintain the lie that black people were bystanders in the forging of the nation. It reinforces the idea that freedom was a gift granted by Lincoln, rather than a right seized by men like John Horse in the swamps of Florida. It keeps the narrative simple, comfortable, and white. But the legacy of the Black Seminoles is not just about the past. It is a live wire burning in the present. The legal battle of their descendants against the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a modern-day civil rights struggle that goes largely unreported. It raises uncomfortable questions about identity, belonging, and the lingering poison of colonial blood quantum laws. When the Seminole Nation voted to exclude the freedmen, denying them the benefits of the $56 million judgment and stripping them of their citizenship, they were using the tools of the oppressor. They were deciding that blood mattered more than history, more than alliance, more than the shared suffering of the Trail of Tears. It is a heartbreaking example of how the trauma of colonization pits oppressed groups against one another, fighting for scraps while the government watches from the sidelines. The descendants of the Scouts, the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Cemetery Association, gather every year in Brackettville on Seminole Days. They clean the headstones. They tell the stories. They wear the regalia. They are the guardians of a flame that the rest of the world wants to extinguish. They are fighting a lonely war against forgetting. They are saying, "We are still here. We matter. Our ancestors paid for this land with their lives, even if they never held the deed." So, what is the lesson for us? What do we take from the Odyssey of John Horse? First, it teaches us that freedom is an action, not a status. John Horse was never legally free in the eyes of many. The courts called him a slave. The treaties called him property. But he acted free. He lived free. He fought free. He proved that freedom is not a piece of paper signed by a politician. It is the refusal to submit. It is the willingness to walk across a continent, to swim a river, to build a home in the desert, rather than bow your head. Second, it teaches us the power of adaptability. The Black Seminoles survived because they could become whatever they needed to be. In Florida, they were swamp fighters. In Oklahoma, they were farmers. In Mexico, they were border guards. In Texas, they were scouts. They mastered every environment, every weapon, and every language. They were the ultimate survivors in a world designed to destroy them. And finally, it teaches us that loyalty must be earned. The Scouts served the U.S. Army with absolute fidelity. They never lost a man. They never disobeyed an order in battle. And the army betrayed them. This is a hard, cold lesson. Institutions will use you. They will take your talent, your labor, and your blood, and when you are no longer useful, they will evict you. The only true loyalty the Black Seminoles found was in each other. Their brotherhood, their community, was the only fortress that never fell. We live in a time where history is under attack. Books are being banned. Teachers are being told what they can and cannot say about race in America. The story of the Black Seminoles is exactly the kind of history that gets banned. It is too radical. It is too empowering. It shows black men with guns defeating white armies. It shows the U.S. government breaking its word over and over again. It is divisive because it is true. That is why it is your duty to remember it. The next time you see a Western movie, look for the black faces that are not there. The next time you hear someone talk about heritage, ask them about the heritage of the men lying in Brackettville. The next time you see a Medal of Honor, remember Adam Payne, shot in the back by the law he swore to uphold. John Horse died in 1882, in Mexico, on a trip to advocate for his people. He never got his reservation. He never got his pension. But he died a man who had never worn chains since the day he broke them. He left behind a legacy that is harder than stone and more enduring than bronze. He left us the blueprint of the unconquered. They tried to enslave them. They failed. They tried to kill them. They failed. They tried to erase them. They failed. Because now, you know the story. You know the name John Horse. You know the name of the Black Seminoles. And as long as one person speaks those names, they are not gone. They are just waiting on the other side of the river, watching to see if we have the courage to finish the journey they started. This history was hidden for a reason. But now it belongs to you. Do not let it slide back into the darkness. If you believe the Black Seminoles deserve their place in the history books, if you believe their descendants deserve justice, hit that like button and share this video. Send it to a friend. Post it online. Force the algorithm to show the world what a real American hero looks like. The history books are wrong. The movies are wrong. But we can set the record straight. Subscribe, and join us as we uncover the stories they do not want you to know. The Unconquered are watching.